364 yards. A rushing touchdown. An 80-yard drive with less than 2 minutes on the clock. And what did the Cleveland Browns do with their quarterback after all of that? They pulled him. They literally pulled their own quarterback off the field in the middle of a drive, in the middle of a moment, in the middle of what could have been the beginning of something real. That is where this story starts, not in a press conference, not in a front office memo, but on that sideline, at that exact moment, when the Cleveland Browns made a decision that exposed everything happening inside that organization. This stopped being about X's and O's the moment head coach Kevin Stefanski stood at that podium and said, and these are his exact words, "That's not my focus." His own starting quarterback. His own rookie. A kid who just put up 364 yards in his debut, who just led an 80-yard drive with under 2 minutes on the clock, and he's not the focus. So today we are going to ask the question that the mainstream football media refuses to ask directly: was this organizational incompetence? Or was the Cleveland Browns front office so afraid of Shedeur Sanders succeeding that they built the conditions for his failure from the inside out? Because an NFL legend went to the film, and what he found should have every football fan in this country furious. Before we get into what happened on that field, you need to understand the full picture of who Shedeur Sanders is and what he walked into when he entered the NFL draft. Shedeur Sanders was selected in the 5th round of the 2025 NFL draft, not because talent evaluators across the league agreed he lacked ability, but because 31 teams made the collective decision to pass on him round after round. Let that number sit with you. 31 teams passed on this quarterback before the Browns made their move in the 5th round. Kurt Warner, a 2-time NFL MVP, a Super Bowl champion, and one of the most respected quarterback evaluators working in the media today, publicly stated that Shedeur Sanders was the most accurate quarterback in the entire draft class. Not the most accurate in the 1st round. Not the most accurate among mid-round prospects. The most accurate in the whole draft. When a man with Kurt Warner's resume and evaluation track record makes that statement, it carries weight that cannot be dismissed with a talking point. So the question becomes uncomfortable very quickly: why did 31 NFL teams pass on the most accurate quarterback in the draft class? The answer to that question is important, and it should make every objective football observer deeply uncomfortable. When the Browns selected Shedeur, the fan base responded immediately. Jersey sales moved. Energy shifted in Cleveland in a way that it had not shifted in a long time. But inside the building, the signals were different from day one. During training camp, while Shedeur was listed on the depth chart as a backup, Dillon Gabriel was receiving first-team reps, not Shedeur. The player the organization had just drafted in the 5th round, the player the fan base was energized by, was not getting consistent work with the starting offensive unit. This is not a minor procedural detail. In the NFL, first-team practice reps are how quarterbacks learn a defense. They are how a quarterback begins to recognize coverage patterns at full speed, with real personnel, running real assignments. You cannot develop a quarterback by keeping him away from the first-team unit and then expressing surprise when he misreads a coverage in a game situation. That is not a development program. That is the appearance of a development program without the substance of one. When Shedeur Sanders finally got his opportunity as the starter, what he put on film was undeniable. The signature play of that game, the one that should have ended the conversation about whether this kid belonged, came when an unblocked pass rusher came screaming through the line with a clear path to the quarterback. Most rookies in that situation panic. Most rookies in that situation eat the sack or throw the ball away without processing what's happening downfield. Shedeur kept his eyes downfield, used his athleticism to escape the pocket, and delivered a 50-yard strike. That play does not happen without two things working together simultaneously: arm talent and the composure to stay mentally present under physical pressure. Those are traits that cannot be coached into a player after the fact. Either a quarterback has that internal clock under duress, or he does not. Shedeur Sanders has it. Cleveland's sideline erupted. The stadium felt it. By the end of the day, Shedeur had accumulated 364 passing yards, a performance that, by any objective measure, demonstrated he was capable of executing at the NFL level. But the conversation around his debut did not stay on the positive. The interception he threw, a misread on a cover 3 coverage, became the centerpiece of a media narrative designed to write him off entirely. Here is the context that narrative deliberately left out: Shedeur Sanders barely saw cover 3 coverage in practice because he barely received first-team reps during training camp. Cover 3 is one of the most commonly deployed base defenses in the NFL. If a quarterback's preparation does not include consistent exposure to that coverage at practice speed, against real defensive personnel running real assignments, the likelihood of a misread in a live game situation increases dramatically. That is not a talent problem. That is a preparation problem, and that preparation problem was created by the organization that was supposed to be setting him up for success. The most revealing moment of the entire game, however, was not the interception. It was what happened at the end. Down by more than a touchdown with under 2 minutes remaining, Shedeur Sanders took the offense on an 80-yard drive in 7 plays, methodical, calm, and efficient under the exact kind of pressure that separates quarterbacks who can win games from quarterbacks who simply manage them. 7 plays. 80 yards. With the game on the line. Your quarterback is hot, the momentum has shifted, the offense is moving, so what do? You pull him for a wildcat formation featuring a running back. That is what the Cleveland Browns did. This is the part of the story that requires your full attention, because it is not a one-time mistake. It is a pattern, and patterns in professional football do not happen by accident. Walk through the arithmetic of the decision the Browns made. They were down 14 points. They needed 2 touchdowns to tie the game. They had a quarterback who had just gone 80 yards in 7 plays with the game on the line. And they removed him from the field, not once, not twice, for a wildcat formation with a running back taking the snap. There is no offensive philosophy, no scheme preference, and no personnel grouping justification that makes that decision logical in that moment. Cleveland's own beat reporters were burning the next morning. This was not outside critics applying pressure from a distance. This was the local media, the people who cover this team every day, who sit in those press conferences, who know this organization, expressing open disbelief at what they had witnessed. When the local reporters who cover a team are publicly questioning a decision the morning after a game, that tells you the level of confusion happening on the ground. Stefanski's post-game answer was 3 words, "It's on me." No explanation. No breakdown of what he was trying to accomplish. No acknowledgement of what Shedeur had just done on that 80-yard drive. 3 words that deflected without addressing anything. An NFL legend went to the film after this game and broke down what he found publicly. What the film showed was not an isolated coaching mistake made in the heat of a difficult situation. The film showed a pattern. The wildcat formation was being called in situations where Shedeur had just demonstrated, on the previous possession or the previous set of plays, that he was capable of making the play that was needed. Multiple times throughout the season, in multiple different game contexts, the same decision was being made. When something happens once, it can be a mistake. When something becomes a repeating pattern in your play calling, it is a decision. And decisions in an NFL organization do not get made without authorization from somewhere in the building. The question that follows from that observation is direct: who gave that order? And more importantly, why? Former NFL running back LeSean "Shady" McCoy looked into the camera and said 4 words about Shedeur Sanders: "You cannot break him." McCoy did not say that for entertainment value. He said it because he had spoken with Shedeur personally and come away with a specific impression, that this quarterback had an internal foundation that was not going to crack regardless of what the external environment looked like. That is a meaningful statement from a man who played in this league at the highest level for over a decade and knows what it takes to survive inside a professional locker room. Every NFL head coach does media preparation before a press conference. That is not speculation, it is standard procedure across the league. Coaches know what questions are coming. They craft answers in advance. They work with their communication staff. The question about Shedeur Sanders' role, his future, and whether the organization was committed to giving him a legitimate opportunity, Stefanski knew that question was coming. He had time to craft a diplomatic answer. He had time to say that the organization was evaluating everything and that Shedeur had shown them something real. He chose not to do any of that. His answer, "That's not my focus right now," was not carelessness. That was intention. Pay attention to how coaches speak about players they believe in, even players who are backups, even players who are struggling through a difficult stretch. There is typically a language of investment, language that signals to the player, to the fan base, and to the media that the organization sees something worth protecting. That language was completely absent whenever Stefanski was asked directly about Shedeur Sanders. The discomfort was visible. The deflection was consistent. The contrast with how a coach typically speaks about a player they are genuinely developing was stark enough that it could not be explained away as personality or communication style. Contrast that with how Shedeur handled his own press conferences throughout this entire situation. Calm. Professional. Calling Stefanski a good coach. Staying on message. Refusing to give the media a flame to throw gasoline on. One of these men was behaving like a professional under pressure. It was not the head coach. And here is the most important structural reality of the entire situation. Kevin Stefanski could not afford to allow Shedeur Sanders to succeed, because if Shedeur played well, Stefanski would have to answer for why he waited as long as he did, why he gave the first-team reps to someone else, why the wildcat was being called on drives where the quarterback was moving the football. He painted himself into a corner. And the only exit from that corner was making sure Shedeur did not produce at a level that made the waiting indefensible. The pressure on the Sanders family throughout this entire period extended far beyond the football field and into a coordinated media environment that was generating negative coverage on a near-weekly basis. Deion Sanders Jr. broke his silence and called out the pattern directly and publicly, noting that every week brought a new negative story, a new narrative designed to undermine the Sanders name. He was not speaking in generalities. He was describing a specific, repeating pattern that the family had been living through since Deion Sanders Sr.'s time at Colorado, and that followed Shedeur into Cleveland. Coach Prime, Deion Sanders Sr. himself, was forced to publicly respond to a story about him wearing a ski mask. To be clear about what that story was, it was a manufactured controversy about a piece of clothing. It had nothing to do with football, nothing to do with the Browns organization, nothing to do with anything that would qualify as legitimate sports journalism. But it ran. It circulated. It generated clicks and attention at the exact moment when the conversation should have been about what his son had just done on a football field. You do not accidentally produce a negative story every single week. That requires effort. That requires sources. That requires someone inside the building, or connected to it, who is feeding information to reporters for a purpose. The local Cleveland media was simultaneously being used to build a narrative around the return of Deshaun Watson, the quarterback the Browns had traded 3 first-round picks to acquire, who had missed significant time due to suspension and injury, while quietly undermining any conversation about Shedeur gaining a permanent foothold at the position. The families began speaking publicly when staying quiet stopped being a viable option. When the Sanders men start saying out loud what they have been experiencing behind closed doors, it is because the situation has reached a point where silence itself has become a form of complicity. Pull back from the individual moments and look at the structural reality of the Cleveland Browns organization right now. 3 wins on the season. A regime that multiple analysts have publicly described as fracturing. The Deshaun Watson situation, 3 first-round draft picks traded, a suspension, injuries, and a return that never materialized into the franchise-altering performance the organization was counting on, has left the front office in a position of accountability that has no clean narrative attached to it. When the Browns traded Joe Flacco and the general manager did not make a public statement addressing the move, something fundamental in the organizational communication structure was already broken. Shedeur Sanders walked directly into the middle of that instability. Not onto a team with a clear identity and a coherent plan. Into a franchise at a crossroads that had no consensus on how to move forward. There is a reasonable argument to be made that Kevin Stefanski is a capable NFL head coach, that in a different organizational structure, with different personnel decisions and a different quarterback situation, he could be a functional and productive head coach at this level. But the Cleveland Browns situation has run its course in a way that cannot be course-corrected from within. Sometimes the environment becomes so fractured that the only productive path forward is to rebuild from the foundation. Sometimes it does not matter who is right and who is wrong in the individual arguments. The environment itself becomes the problem. Here is what the film and the numbers tell us about Shedeur Sanders when everything around him is stripped away. 5th-round draft pick. No first-team practice reps during training camp. A head coach who repeatedly expressed disinterest in developing him publicly. A media environment actively generating negative coverage. Play-calling decisions that physically removed him from the field in his biggest moments. And inside all of that, 364 yards, an 80-yard drive under 2 minutes, and the composure to stay professional through every press conference and every public moment that followed. If that is the floor, if that is what Shedeur produces with every possible obstacle placed in front of him, then the ceiling of what he is capable of in a functional organizational environment is a genuinely important question for the future of this league. Every player who gets sabotaged by their own organization faces a choice that defines what comes next. Some break under the weight of it, under the public narrative, under the coaching instability, under the combination of being undermined and then held responsible for the consequences of being undermined. Others build something that cannot be taken away from them, regardless of what the organization does. Based on the humility Shedeur has shown in his press conferences, based on the composure he demonstrated on that 80-yard drive, and based on what Shady McCoy said directly after speaking with him personally, this does not look like a man who is going to break. Not even close. The Cleveland Browns may have committed one of the most damaging acts of organizational self-sabotage in recent NFL history. They had a quarterback their own fan base wanted. They had a quarterback that Kurt Warner, one of the most respected evaluators of the position alive today, called the most accurate in the entire draft class. They had a quarterback who produced 364 yards and an 80-yard game-closing drive with no first-team reps and a coaching staff that was publicly indifferent to his development. And they did everything within their structural power to ensure he could not succeed in a way that would hold them accountable for waiting as long as they did to give him the opportunity. Was it pure organizational incompetence? Was it personal? Was it institutional fear of being proven wrong by a fifth-round pick who the fan base loved before the front office did? Drop your answer in the comments right now, and tell us exactly where you stand on what happened in Cleveland. This conversation is far from over, and the next chapter of this story is going to reveal even more about how this organization operates. If this video opened your eyes to something the mainstream media has been unwilling to say clearly, do us a favor and hit that like button. It costs you nothing and it tells the algorithm that real football coverage matters. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we are just getting started, and we are not done covering this story until the full truth is on the table. Shedeur Sanders is not done. Not even close. And neither are we.